Good morning, friends. Thank you for coming, despite the weather. I'd like to welcome you all to the press launch of the report Climate Rights International, Broken Promises, Philippine Nickel Mining, Process Rights Abuses, and Climate Vulnerability. My colleague, Krista Shinam, who's here, the researcher for CRI, will be talking about this report and a lot more other issues this morning. And joining her will be JB Garganera of Alianza Tigil Mina, who has been invaluable, whose group has been invaluable in making this research possible. And so, again, thank you. We have a good mix here of journalists and members of civil society. We have here some people from government, some individuals from government, very good friends. So we're very happy na nandito na you all are here. To start off this launch, I'm going to ask Krista to walk us through the process of getting out this report and later on also tell us what the findings are and more importantly, the recommendations. And after Krista, we will have a short a video presentation taken by of a video created by our good friend Erwin Mascareñas and his team. Very fine video, excellent video, and you will see it in a bit. But meantime, Krista.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. Like Carlos said, I'm Krista Shenham. I'm a researcher at Climate Rights International. So CRI, we're an international human rights and climate organization. We document the links between the climate crisis and the human rights crisis. And we also do advocacy for governments and companies, other decision makers to advance justice for local communities. So this report that we're launching now, Broken Promises, documents the human rights, environmental, and climate impacts of nickel mining in the Philippines. We focus on the Caraga region, which is home to more metallic mines than any other part of the Philippines. Particularly, we focus on Surigao del Sur and Dinagat Island. And so these are two regions that have a significant number of nickel mines, including many nickel mines that are in close proximity to each other. So just to really start, I'd like to acknowledge that, the Philippines is one of the most vulnerable countries to the climate crisis. And broadly, we find that some communities are not only impacted from the climate crisis, but are also experiencing serious consequences from efforts to address the climate crisis. And we find this in regions that are rich with minerals like nickel, where there is a significant amount of mining. So CRI decided to do this investigation because the Philippines is the world's second largest producer of nickel. We've previously released 3 reports on the impacts of nickel mining and processing in Indonesia, the world's largest producer of nickel. So nickel is a key mineral used in the energy transition. So there is another climate angle here. So, the raw minerals that are used to power batteries also have an impact on people and the environment. And really, we're seeing a huge growth in the demand for nickel. So demand is projected to increase roughly 60% by 2040, almost exclusively because of electric vehicles and other batteries. I can't understate how critical it is to stop burning fossil fuels and transition to renewables. We absolutely must stop burning fossil fuels. That said, the push to transition to renewables cannot be used as an excuse to harm the rights of local communities, including frontline communities in the Philippines. So for this report, we interviewed roughly 60 people living near and downstream nickel mines in Dinagat Island and Surigao del Sur, who talked about the ways that nickel mining is impacting their rights and making them more vulnerable to the climate crisis. Like I said, these impacts are quite severe. And before I get into diving through all of the key findings of the report, I'd really like to start by you not hearing it from me, but actually from the communities and many of the people who we interviewed. And so we'll kind of transition into sharing a short documentary, and then hopefully this tech goes quite smoothly. And then I'll kind of come back in and go through the findings of the report.
Because the mining here is in our watershed. Water is our life. Water is life. If there's no water, there's no rice. If there's no rice, there's no food. That is our mantra.
The Caraga region in the southern Philippines is the heart of the country's mining industry, home to dozens of nickel mines. Nickel is essential for the transition to renewable energy. In recent years, nickel mining in the Philippines, the world's second largest producer of nickel, has expanded rapidly to supply materials for electric vehicle batteries and other forms of renewable energy. But for some communities living near these mines, global energy transition has come at a high cost.
Sa kinatibukan na ay nalapas nga right to food security, right to healthful environment. Kani nga mga katungod dapat mao ning dipinsahan sa gobyerno. Nya mura mahinon ato kit muluhod daani maningkamot ani para ihatag. Pero ang naana sa atong batagang balaod, ang right to healthful environment, ang right to food security mas grabe na kay sa taas nga panahon nagdepende ang mga tao sa agrikultura. Pero ang mina mao ay dako nga hulga sa agrikultura. O kung mayroon agrikultura, muna source sa income for the long generations, centuries. So nakapa-eskwela sila, nakapabalay sila, nakapa-abroad sila, unsa may ilang ginabuhat sa ilang income, they live a decent life tungod sa agrikultura. Pero kini karon sa nagihimo sa mina, dako kini nga hulga sa panginabuhi o kinabuhi sa uban. Tungod kay kung maguba na pod gyud, mas delikado man ang baha pod. So ang panginabuhian ug mismo ilang kinabuhi maoy napahamtang.
The way nickel mining is carried out is making local communities who bear no responsibility for the climate crisis even more vulnerable to climate impacts, including extreme weather events. The destruction of forests and mangroves not only erases livelihoods, it also removes natural protection from the heavy rain, severe typhoons, and storm surges. Fishing and farming once sustained rural communities, but pollution from nickel mines has put those traditions at risk. Rivers filled with mining waste now overflow during storms, turning waterways brown and filling once clear bays with mud. Families who once relied on the land and sea are running out of options.
Sa unang mga panahon, ma'am, sawa pa ng mining diha, kaning among basakan ana pagadzong kamaadyo. Among gasto sa abono gamay ra, usahay dili pa namo ipinuno amo rang isabuwag. Di na ma'am katunggan, dili na maingon ng gasto og kuan kay daghan pang mga kinhason isda makuha. Pagkakaroon nga naa na ng mining diha wa na. Pangisda wa na, kinhason wa na, ug kining labod gazud nga nas among basakan mao gazud nay among gi kuan karon nga mahatagan nag tubag or kani among mga kuan nga masulbad ning among labod ug maunsa na nga gabi na gazud namong dahin siya nga giduol wa gazud mi maka wa mi matabangi wa mi maka way makasulbad ang buton sa una. Kami dinhi sa among lugar, ang among panginabuhian, panagat sa laod, panagat sa dinhi sa katunggan, mamukot ug isda, mga limango. Wa mi lain ka panginabuhian, panagat ra gyud. Sa wa pang kumpanya, ang panagat gyud dinhi sa among dapit, daghan pa gyud ang mapailin-ilinan og asa kadapit manguha og mga pang parte sa dagat nga mga kuan kay kinhason. Ang kinhason ara sa duol, daghan pa mi og kinhason. Kaning dinhi kanang sa pantalan namo. Panaanan pa na og mga isda nga mga lagmi nga isda kay tin-aw na diha kaadyo. Kung sa dihang ning abot ang mining, dili na mi maka sa among hunasan, dili na mi makapanginhas, dili na makapamaling kay lapok na ang dagat. Og sa didto pud sa Katunggan, dapat na mga libuo, na mga daghan kinhason pa, mga pasayan, mga kanang lukon nga pwede mano mi diha. Pero kay malubog naman gud siya og uwanon kay naa naman ang lapoks nga gikan sa kumpanya. Mao nga dako kadyong diferensya ang sawa pa ang kumpanya ug sa karon nga naa na sila. Kay dili man gud plastado ang ilang kumpanya.
Locals who speak out against the impacts of mining have been threatened, harassed, and even killed. Anti-mining advocates have also faced baseless lawsuits, red tagging, harassment, and intimidation. For many, protecting their land means risking their safety.
Kung mosupa ka sila sa kabutang, sama sa kakatong mga revolutionary nga gustong kabaguhan. So mao kana nga nadawit ang akong ngalan, that's how they portrayed me. I am a communist priest, napakoy sungay, na-shock ko, and after that, nahadlo ko kay kabalota nga kung na red tagging, may killing ang mosunod. This is the pattern. Ilasag ka i-reduce into nobody, nothing. Diha dayong ka puuhon o patyon. So nahadlo ko, apan siguro nahurot ra kong kahadlok, eventually.
In Surigao del Sur, community advocates like Emma Hotchkiss have been at the forefront of efforts to protect the environment from the impacts of nickel mining.
So the Philippines being an island nation, a nation of islands, we won't use that many, electric cars or vehicles. What we're doing is mining our nickel for batteries for first world countries.
The Philippines contributes less than 0.5% of global emissions, yet it bears some of the heaviest burdens of both the climate crisis and the global mineral rush. Communities affected by nickel mining want and deserve a livable future. The world needs nickel, but the energy transition must respect the rights of communities on the front line.
Wala may tambong nga transition kung wala justisya.
Thanks for listening to everyone in that video. Really, to highlight, to start with the report, broken promises. This is a direct quote that we heard from many people across the region. People, when mining came, were promised jobs, were provided economic opportunities, and increases to their livelihood. And broadly, they feel like those promises made to them were broken. They were empty. So really to start by outlining the impacts of the report that are documented in the report, which you've seen a teaser in with the video. The first is around the climate crisis. As I mentioned at the beginning, mining is making communities more vulnerable to the impacts of the climate crisis. This is happening in a few ways. One, through the destruction of mangroves, severe weather events. As we're seeing currently right now, directly hit last night by Typhoon Tino. The destruction of these mangroves and these forests protect communities. They're natural climate solutions. And so we lose these really important parts of the natural ecosystem. We make communities directly more vulnerable. The second around climate change is the impacts of flooding. So as the climate crisis worsens in the Philippines, there's projected to be more intense rainfall events and more flooding. We've seen that mining is exacerbating this climate impact. Siltation and runoff from mining areas is choking rivers. It's making rivers more shallow as more and more sediment gets dumped into rivers. So when you have increased rain events, those rivers are much more likely to overflow, to cloud agricultural fields, to flood homes, cause incredible destruction. Really, across Surigao del Sur, Dinagat Island, we interviewed people who told us how mining impacts their rights, including their rights to livelihoods, to food, to water, and to a healthy environment. The pollution from nickel mining, including the siltation, has had a significant impact on local livelihoods. Fisher folk who we interviewed said that their catches have significantly reduced, if not completely destroyed. Local fisheries have completely been decimated. Some fisher folk in Ayoki Island off Pantilan and Surigao del Sur told us that people now sometimes go missing at sea. The, the pollution from nickel mines has destroyed the close shore fisheries, making it so people have to go much farther to sea, facing heavy waves and much more severe consequences. And this is an unintended consequence of nickel mining. In Dinagat Island, we interviewed fisherwomen who would historically catch crabs in the mangroves. They told us that if there are any crabs, they're really small now. Most of them have been gone. And sometimes when you crack open the crab to eat it, their bodies are filled with red mud. This is from mining areas. Communities across the board are seeing this impact. Farmers also are struggling to continue their traditional way of life, including particularly rice farmers, as many rice areas are in lowland areas much more susceptible to flooding. When mining runoff and silt chokes plants, it kills the agricultural fields. For many, as I mentioned, these promises of good jobs have not been met. We interviewed temporary workers within the nickel industry and former workers who said they were earned below minimum wage, had unreliable employment, and severe occupational health and safety hazards. These impacts on livelihoods are not only economic impacts, but also human rights impacts, and they impact other rights, particularly the right to food. We interviewed people across Dinagat Island, Surigao del Sur, who reported a significant increase in their food insecurity, families that no longer have enough food to eat because of the destruction of their fisheries and farmlands. In both regions, people told us that they could not afford food, they couldn't grow food, and otherwise have difficulties accessing enough food. For example, a fisherman on Ayoki Island told us there are days on end where his family has nothing to eat but breadfruit because they can't catch fish. A mother in Dinagat Island told us that their family is hungry most of the time. In addition to this food impact, there's also impact on the right to water, including when mining activities are happening in watersheds that communities depend on for their drinking water. Communities also reported significant concerns about their health, including the impacts of dust from mining areas and from hauling roads. Particulate matter is incredibly damaging to people's health when it's breathed in. Residents report increased rates of respiratory illnesses like asthma, cases where inactive tuberculosis has gone into active TB, which again is linked to exposure to pollution. We also interviewed former workers who were forced to quit their jobs in mining areas because of occupational health problems breathing that they developed on the job. In some cases, this economic impact from the destruction of livelihood is also having an impact on children's right to education. In some cases, mining areas are located dangerously close to schools, and in other cases, parents say their children have challenges going to school, both from a lack of access to food and the exposure of mining and the health problems related to mining. In some cases, companies have failed to compensate communities for the use of their lands. Particularly in Dinagat, we interviewed multiple residents in Barangay Malino in Tubajon who reported not receiving proper compensation from mining companies that used their lands to haul, to store ore, or for other purposes. So, people who are no longer able to access their lands that they have legal, land certificates to, they're paying the taxes on, are not able to access those lands or receive compensation. A lack of transparency from companies is making this entire situation much worse. Local governments that we met and spoke to, as well as local communities, so they don't have even basic information about what companies are doing, levels of pollution, and other really important things that communities need and local governments need to take steps to protect them and their rights. Some who speak out report very significant threats to their safety and security, as talked about in the video. There have been instances of violent attacks, criminalization, and harassment. We talked with multiple people, including a local politician and an activist, who were informed that they had a bounty put on their head for their outspoken position being against mining. These are very significant threats and absolutely prevent people from speaking out. In many cases in the report, we have redacted people's names out of fear of retaliation. And so just to highlight, these are very significant concerns for local communities. So in addition to all of these human rights impacts and climate impacts, we also documented information about beneficial ownership of some of the companies that are in the Caraga region, as well as the downstream supply chains where this nickel is going. So many nickel mines in the Caraga region have links to powerful actors in the Philippines, including active and former politicians, politically connected families, and wealthy business people. It's really incredible and really important to highlight that whenever a politician or their close family members do have ties to an industry, there is an inherent risk that the company interests may be placed above the interests of the public. And so as part of our recommendations, we're calling on people who have active interests to divest. Most of the nickel mines in the Philippines, and the nickel ore does not stay in the Philippines. Most of it is exported as raw ore. And so with more than 90% of the nickel ore that's exported, it ends up in China, with the rest of the 10% going to Indonesia, Japan, and South Korea. Notably, exports of nickel ore from the Philippines to Indonesia increased 4,000% between 2023 and 2024. And so this nickel, like we talked about before, is going into electric vehicle supply chain, it's going into the production of stainless steel. And notably, these companies that are importing nickel from the Philippines have responsibilities regarding their human rights due diligence to ensure they are not sourcing nickel from places where it's causing significant human rights and environmental harms. The good news here is that it does not have to be this way. These are very significant impacts, but there are laws and regulations on the books today in the Philippines that would prevent many of these harms from happening. One of our first key recommendations in the report is for the Filipino government to fully enforce its laws and regulations to ensure that communities' rights and the environment are respected in this industry. We're also calling on the Filipino government to stop permitting new mines until the industry cleans up its act. If the industry is not following laws, if it's not fully enforcing and complying, then to add more mines is quite concerning. We're also calling on the government to investigate companies and for their links to human rights abuses as well as environmental pollution, and most importantly, to make the results of those investigations publicly available and accessible to local communities. Particularly, these are the responsibilities of the Department of Energy and Natural Resources and the Mines and Geosciences Bureau, which have authority over the impacts of mines and environmental pollution in the Philippines. Across the board, companies should ensure that they are respecting the environment and respecting the rights of local communities, that they're consulting with communities, that they're providing information, and that they're responding to grievances when those are filed. They should take urgent steps to make their operations and basic information, including environmental impact assessments and data about air and water pollution, publicly available and accessible. Our report also calls on downstream companies, the electric vehicle companies that are using nickel in their batteries, including in the global north, in North America, in Europe, to ensure that they are conducting full human rights investigations into their supply chain, that they should be using their leverage as purchasers who have a lot of money and are paying a lot of money for this nickel to ensure that they are not sourcing it from places where it's, contributing to these significant abuses. COP30 is next week. The Philippines government has been a really outspoken champion on climate justice. And I think it's an important time to remember that climate justice is not just the impacts of the climate crisis, but also just transition. That the transition does not leave people behind, and that includes frontline mining communities, here in the Philippines. So really just to end, and I'll pass the mic over to JB, but really, like I said, the urgency of the climate crisis is not an excuse for human rights abuses. And we need urgent action to ensure that the people who are most impacted, including frontline communities in Dinagat Island and Surigao del Sur, are fully respected. Thank you.
Thanks, Krista. I'll open with Filipino. Halos 2 taon na po pag nag-assessment ang Alyansa Tigil Mina, ang prominenteng description sa mga apektadong komunidad, yan, yung mga affected communities ay ang mga environmentalists, human rights, at yung affected communities ay pagod, gutom, at takot. In the last 2 years, that has been our observation. Affected communities are tired, hungry, and afraid. And a lot of the reasons why disaffected communities are tired, hungry, and afraid are captured in the report. And so when Climate Rights International and Sir Kaloy approached ATM and the other environmental groups, are we interested to engage and support in this research? We readily said this is something that is very important for us. Precisely because we needed a continuing documentation and evidence of how the communities that are affected by nickel mining are part of those sacrifice zones that are being created to satisfy the requirement for additional transition minerals. So, as Alyansa Tigil Mina, we excitedly endorse this report as we actively engaged and supported CRI in contacting and facilitating the data gathering in the affected communities. The stories presented in the report capture the daily struggles and suffering, and that is very important. While some companies and slight possibility the country is profiting from nickel mining, the suffering it has created and is creating confirms that the destructive and long-term impacts of mining create more disadvantages for the Filipinos. But we're excited and happy about a very specific section on the report, and this is the downstream supply chain. There are very few studies that analyze where does the minerals of the Philippines actually end up and who is actually benefiting. So this section on the report is very timely, is very important for us, especially to explain to the local governments and to the affected communities that we are not benefiting from the extraction of this mining. So that supply chain study in the report is very, very important. And the updates in that report validates a common knowledge among us that a significant amount, I think it's 90% 90% of our nickel ore goes to China. And that completes the story. We are not benefiting from the extraction of nickel in our country. But many of our communities are suffering the consequences of this destructive mining. I think a lot of the arguments in the report support the counter narrative of many environmental and human rights defenders. The dominant narrative now is we need more minerals to attain the clean energy transition. We need to extract more nickel, more copper, more lithium, more cobalt to have the Paris alignment, to meet the Paris trajectory of 1.5 and to achieve the clean energy and partially to also go away from fossil fuels. We need to extract more mines. I think that's only telling half of the story. The other half of the story is that we need to start discussing what are the adjustments that the first world country and the northern countries have to seriously consider. Degrowth, circular economy, and of course, we want the alternative energy sources, but certainly creating more vehicles that are electric without addressing transport mobility for the masses is not the right direction. We cannot be extracting more nickel for electric batteries so that millions more in the north and the first world countries can continue their nice way of having their own individual cars. We have to seriously discuss degrowth, circular economy, and reduction of our natural, the exploitation of our natural resources. The term responsible mining was captured in the report. It's a bit uneasy for us, to support the concept, but we do recognize that that is a central argument of the government and the mining industry. Then we put our argument on the table. Let us debate what is responsible mining, because unless there is a legal definition of what responsible mining is, all of these circular arguments and these narrow justifications will continue on without addressing many of the issues contained in the same report. And we put that challenge to the government and to the industry itself. Let us put a legal definition of what responsible mining is. We put parameters on how we can hold both the industry and the government accountable, and then let us measure how responsible or not the industry and the government is. We are not shying away from that debate, but let us put that debate on a very formal and constructive manner. Let's debate what responsible mining is. Right now, unless there is a specific law and a legal basis to define and measure what is responsible mining, the mining industry and the government is just greenwashing and rebranding themselves. Part of the broken promise that I think should be emphasized on this report launch is that there is a connivance between our elected officials, the government, and the mining industry. The impunity was mentioned several times in the report. And we argue impunity is there in the mining industry because our elected leaders are beneficial owners of mining industry. We have a beneficial ownership research, and we can trace the influence and political power of elected officials and their families and the families and their circle of friends who are directors and owners of mining companies. And that is why you have mining companies eating up smaller mining companies because of the influence of the politicians. And that is why you have mining companies who blatantly disregard environmental laws, the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, and even local autonomy because they know they have padrinos who are senators and a former Speaker of the House, whose family traces a long history of ownership of mining corporations. And this impunity will continue. This broken promise will continue because of the lack of transparency and accountability of mining companies who have direct connections with politicians. There will always be a failure of regulation because of undue influence of these politicians to the DNR who has miserably failed on their mandate. Well, for us, this report launch is very significant also because the report captures the bitter stories in Dinagat Island and in Surigao. We are afraid this bitter story will be replicated in Barm and in the northern Philippines, where we have seen an increase of mining applications on nickel because of the temptation to address that global demand on nickel. And the bitterness and the impunity and the tiredness and the hunger and the fear will be replicated across the country because we still have this beneficial ownership and connivance between politicians and the mining corporations. Now, in closing, we firmly believe that the recommendations of this report should be seriously considered by the government. And for the DNR, we extend an invitation. If the communities and environmental human rights defenders groups are ready and willing to constructively engage the DNR, but don't shy away. We challenge DNR Secretary Popo Lotilla, face us. No, don't hide in your office and then wish that all the complaints and petitions will go away. It will not. You will find subsequent cases filed against you in the DNR if you do not face the communities and if you do not adequately address the petitions and the complaints and the issues, some of which are already covered in this report. While we extend this invitation for constructive engagement with the DNR, Alianza Tigil Mina stands in solidarity with all the affected communities. All forms of resistance, oppositions, and struggles are legitimate in this case. When the lives and livelihoods and the rights of affected communities are being trampled upon by the mining corporations and the regulatory agencies such as DNR are failing miserably on their mandate. And for this, we hope that the recommendations can be taken up seriously so that the tiredness, the fear, and the hunger will not anymore be replicated in other countries. But thank you to Climate Rights International. And we are ready to use the report in other advocacy fronts across the whole spectrum of our campaign, from legal front to legislative track, and addressing directly the petitions and the inaction from the DNR. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sir JB and Krista. We now go to the open forum question and answer section of our little event here. But first, I'd like to ask Krista to answer a very important point about our engagement with government, the thing that Mr. Garganera pointed out. We did send invitations to the DNR, MGB, but got no response at all. So please, and also to the companies.
Yeah, so one of our practices, we're an independent organization, and so we always give the opportunity for relevant government agencies, for companies to provide their input. So, roughly a month before the release of this report, we wrote to DNR, we wrote to MGB, both national and Region 13, the Caraga region. We wrote to the Department of Labor. We wrote to, almost 10 mining companies that are named in this report. Out of all of those letters, we had one response. And so that response from one company is included in the appendix to our report. And so you can also see the letters that we sent in the appendix to the report. We're asking pretty basic questions often. How are you monitoring these mines? How are you monitoring the environmental pollution? Yet we had, no response. And so, we're very happy to include those responses if we do get them after the publication of the report. But I think it sends a clear signal that, civil society organizations, independent organizations are writing, seeking very basic information and not receiving responses. And so I encourage you to look at the letters that we sent. Again, they're in the appendix of the report online.
Thank you. So now, this is a mix of civil society and media. So, but anybody can pose questions. Yes, please identify yourself and your organization.
Good morning. I'm Ron Kalunsad of Kyodo News, Japanese news agency. Just want to find out first, when did you start interviewing people there? And did your communication also include with the provincial governments of Dinagat and Surigao del Sur and any response from the governors?
Yeah, so we started really kind of scoping this research almost a year ago, and a big section of the fieldwork was done this January and February, so earlier in 2025. As part of that, we interviewed multiple mayors in both regions, including other government officials as well, barangay captains on the local level. And part of the reach out to governments, we wrote to the Surigao del Sur Provincial Police Commission regarding an alleged murder last year of a barangay captain, and did not receive a response to that letter either. But so this is almost a year's worth of research and investigation, both the interviews of directly impacted people, of local officials, as well as over the other open source research. We reviewed company documents, legal filings, laws, regulations, NGO reports, media reports. So the report is really constructed based on information from a very wide number of sources. But I think the most important part is the local communities. So throughout the report, you'll also see lots of quotes and direct testimony from people in their own words.
May I also ask, did you get to find out when the nickel mining started in Dinagat Islands?
Yeah, so the exact date is in the report, but during the period of U.S. colonization of the Philippines, the entire Dinagat Island was designated as a mineral reservation. So I believe this is in the 1930s, and so this classification as a mineral reservation changes the process of permitting there. So some of these mines have been going on, and a lot of the mining in Dinagat has gone on for quite a significant period of time. Some of the other mines are newer, so maybe from the 1990s. And I think one thing that was really powerful for me in doing many of these interviews was how these mines have been going on for quite some time, and so the impacts are really severe. The number of people whose lives have been shattered because mining has been going on for so long with so little accountability, is quite significant. And so also in the report, for both Surigao del Sur and from Dinagat, we have, information about all of the active nickel mines, including information about their MPSA, the number of hectares of those concessions. And so that's found under the chapter on corporate actors within the report that has also specific information about when each of those mines started.
Finally, from me, sir, can you tell us about how Japan benefits from these operations here?
Yeah, of course. So, one of the top exporters or top importers of nickel ore from the Philippines, of course, after China is Japan. So within, there are, Japanese companies that are vested in nickel processing within the region, and also just understanding where those, supply chains are going. So there's very clear documentation over, the nickel ore that is extracted in the Caraga region, that is exported to Japan, and then further refined into battery grade nickel that goes to major battery companies in Japan. It's absolutely critical that, Japanese companies that are using this nickel, again, are conducting their significant human rights due diligence, that they're investigating the sources of this nickel, that they're holding their suppliers accountable when there are instances of harms. These companies have a lot of leverage. Like I said before, they could demand, that the companies that they're supplying for clean up their supply chains. And I think a lot of these downstream Japanese companies probably have human rights policies and supplier policies already that demand human rights standards within their full supply chain. So it's important that we understand actually how these Japanese companies are really making sure those policies are working in practice, that they are not just a piece of paper, but are really actively practicing due diligence. Thank you.
Sir JB, you want to add something?
Well, Japan is a far second in that nickel import data. But I think eventually a lot of the Chinese imports of nickel here do end up in Japan later on, because what we export are raw nickel, what Japan needs are processed nickel already. So it has to go to China first. But I think the more significant exposure of Japan is on the processing here. Sumitomo and Taganito are generally, we had the Japanese group study their exposure, and on paper, they are not the dominant stockholders. But if you go deeper and deeper, it's basically a lot of the finances from Japanese investors, and about 3 or 4 more layers deep. Eventually, it's the Japanese manufacturing industry that are eventually benefiting in making sure that the 2 nickel processing plants here are delivering the semi-processed nickel to China.
Any other questions?
Good morning, sir. Rafael Bosano po from ABS-CBN. So one of the recommendations of the study is to enforce the policies, but I also want to know if you think that there are policies that are missing or legislations that the government needs in order to protect the communities in these mining areas.
I think the first order for the DNR is to ensure that they are adequately enforcing the existing laws. Decentralization law, a major issue is that a lot of local governments are not adequately consulted, and many of them actually resist and oppose. So, I mean, from South Cotabato, I know in Dinagat Island that the municipality of Tubahon has an actual ordinance and resolution opposing any entry or expansion of the nickel mining operations in their area. I know Carmen in Surigao del Sur has a resolution against the entry of nickel mining in their locality. So that one, DNR must ensure that that the consent and consultation of local governments are genuinely delivered. Second is the free, prior, and informed consent of indigenous. So that's one set. DNR has miserably failed in delivering the existing regulatory mandates. Now, if there are other laws that we would like to propose, a lot of it is contained in the Alternative Minerals Management Bill or the Philippine Mineral Resources Act. But I would say a very specific law or additional policy that we would like to be passed is really reconciling our land use. A National Land Use Act is now necessary given the context of climate change. We cannot have powerful politicians and powerful corporations deciding what would be the most profitable use of a piece of land. The use of the land should benefit the greater Filipino nation. And that can only be achieved if there is a rational basis on what is the best use of a land. It cannot be decided on the board office of a mining corporation and then later on the government officials are going to accept whatever is the most profitable use of the land. So I think a National Land Use Act is necessary for us now.
Yeah, thanks. And just to echo Sir JB, the Philippines has a lot of really strong laws and regulations on the books. So a big question here is really around the enforcement of those, including around, for example, environmental impact assessment process and consultations. We interviewed communities that say they were selectively not included in public consultations because it was publicly aware that those communities were against mining, even in cases where they were directly downstream. And so really having broader understanding of the fact of the purposes of these laws are meant to protect people, but also to protect conflict. When you consult people at the beginning of the process, you understand their concerns, and so the companies can take the proper steps to actually address those concerns before they occur. And so I think, not understanding these as just laws on the books, but also that they are important for companies. They can really prevent a lot of this conflict, let alone these really serious human rights violations. And so I think really the key here is, this enforcement and reducing this impunity.
Just one more question for Krista. Perhaps CRI has knowledge if there are other countries with a similar experience, like the Philippines, that has successfully veered away from this type of practice.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So I would say one thing that the other kind of bit of research that I've been doing for the last 3 years at Climate Rights International is investigating the human rights, environmental, and climate impacts of nickel mining and processing in Indonesia. So one of the key differences between these two countries is that most of the ore that's exported from the Philippines that's mined here is exported versus Indonesia processes all nickel ore domestically. And actually, to unfortunately not answer your question, is a lot of these impacts are similar. That you have severe human rights abuses, environmental pollution, and climate impacts, including through the build out of captive coal plants that are built to directly power nickel processing in Indonesia. And so I think, you know, we're seeing it in many other countries where there is this big push for transition minerals, including, you know, in sub-Saharan Africa and the push to, you know, mine more cobalt and copper in Latin America with lithium. And I think the rush of the energy transition, and in many ways, is being used as an excuse to build these mines quickly, to deal with the impacts later. And I think this could be an opportunity for the Philippines to be the global leader. You know, it is an outspoken leader on climate justice and attacking the climate crisis. And so, you know, I would love to see the Philippines be, you know, a country to clean up these, you know, these harms that are happening to local communities, particularly when there is this environment and this legal regulatory framework that could really be used in order to see that happen.
Some more, yeah.
Just to add to what Mr. Rafael said a while ago in your response to that, the PENCAS law is another law that is very important to implement, to enforce, because it's about natural capital accounting and ecosystem valuation. So you really try to determine if the cost of what you're getting from the environment or extracting from the environment is really greater than what you have to do to solve those issues later on. So solve all the issues that mining, you know, causes on an environment. And second, I just have a question. What is preventing all these mining companies from focusing on urban mining or recycling from used batteries rather than extracting from the environment?
Yeah, and thanks for adding your point about the first question. Yeah, if anyone else in this space would like to, especially, you know, our allies in civil society would like to make any inputs, please feel free to do so and raise your hand. Really on the kind of role of mining versus the end of the life cycle. So one thing that's good about nickel is that it is infinitely recyclable. You know, once it's mined, it can be continuously used and repurposed. And so, you know, Sir JB's point around the need for circularity is absolutely critical. That there are places, you know, there's systems and processes in place to make sure that once, you know, these batteries and these other uses of nickel, you know, reach the end of their life, that they're not just put into a landfill and that they are repurposed. I think with EVs, we're at a really interesting place where electric vehicles really haven't been around that long. So we haven't quite reached the place where there's kind of commercial viability of, you know, recycling batteries, because there's not that many EV batteries to be recycled. But I think it's absolutely important that companies start increasing investments urgently in this circularity. You know, one of the differences of some of this metal mining like nickel and extractives and fossil fuels like mining for coal is you don't have to keep doing it over and over again. You could extract nickel one time and use it for the rest of time. You can continuously recycle it and repurpose it. And so that is why it is so important that the Philippines gets it right the first time, so that you don't have these endless cycles of extraction like we've seen for decades and centuries with fossil fuels.
Thank you. Any more questions? Comment? Yeah.
Yeah, hi, I'm Marie. I just wanted to say that I think what we really have to watch out for also is if the Philippines follows the model of Indonesia, for example, because what did Indonesia do with its nickel industry? So remember, they banned the exportation of mining and they wanted to use it for domestic use, for domestic processing, so they can so the economy, the national economy, they can earn from it, no? It's so magiging pakinabang yan sa bansa nila. So very wise yung ginawa. Kaya lang ang ginawa ng Indonesia ay so slowly it built up its downstream industry. So it put up all these smelting plants, no? Isa-isa, while at the same time banning the exportation of nickel. So ngayon, ang nangyari, at this point, Chris and I just came from a conference in Indonesia. Now they're driving the price of nickel downward. And lalo lang hindi kumita yung mga minahan. So issue yan sa mga labor workers at mga smelting companies, etc. But I think and then more recently, we heard that the Philippine government is asking Indonesia for advice on how we can follow that path of really building our downstream industry. So there is another mounting threat, no, on this, no, because in Indonesia, the smelting plants are powered by, guess what? By coal. So it didn't only expand mining, it expanded coal production, no? I mean, coal energy production, fossil fuel use. And so if we follow that path, that will really be a double jeopardy for us. Where I'm not sure if we will ever ban the export of mining kasi we're a far second to Indonesia, no? In fact, Indonesia, because they needed more for their processing, they imported from us. So that's why what they mentioned that a small portion of the exports goes to Indonesia or went to Indonesia at one point. But anyway, our nickel, well, I did a little bit of research. So 55% goes to stainless steel. Okay, the demand for stainless steel is inelastic because, I mean, steel is needed every construction, etc. But what really has driven it was as they mentioned, was the EV industry, and 45% of our nickel goes to that. So I think we need to do more research on this and how we're able to, how do you want that industry to grow? Because there are also researches that says we really don't need to expand our nickel mining. We have enough for what we need. We have enough at the present moment. I think what we needed to do is really have these standards, clean up the supply chain. And I think we can get the economic premium from selling or exporting green nickel, whatever that means. No, it's the same thing as JB was saying, what's responsible mining. So what is green nickel, no? But I really hope we'd go that path rather than double jeopardizing ourselves with coal-fired powered nickel smelters. And this mining continues to expand. So what we want to do is to really stop that, put up, have an industrial policy that would have the economic benefit redound to our economy, and at the same time prevent nickel smelters being powered by fossils. So I mean, I think it's time to envision some kind of a policy, because if it's there already, you know, I mean, it has to make wealth for the poor communities. The prosperity has to be with the communities where the nickel mines are. So if we can envision that and the pathway towards that, I guess this is what we have to push with our government.
Thank you. Erwin.
I would just like to ask regarding what she just mentioned about our poor communities, that they should get wealth from it. But unfortunately, what we've seen over the past 10 years of going back again and again in those communities is when we ask these people, most of them would say that we regretted allowing mining, or we regretted that we were deceived by their promises. Because once they started, they just keep on growing and growing, no matter how many complaints, no matter how many cases. Cantelan just lost their 15-year-old case a month ago, and now they're refiling the case. So my question is, how can we ensure this? What can our CSOs look into to ensure this? Because for most people there, example, they're working in the mines for like until November, until October, because nobody is allowed to work in the mines by November, December, January, February, because that's what the mines consider as off season, because it's the rainy season. And so now these people who are previously farmers who are working in the mines, who wants to go back farming, cannot farm anymore, because since it's rainy season, most of the silt in the mines go to their farms, and then most of the silt in the mines also go to their waterways, so they can't also fish. So the question there for most is that if the mines continues to grow, how can these poor, impoverished communities continue to survive? Because example, another issue here is salary. Most of them are being promised like 3 months, 4 months. Sometimes they don't receive several months of salary. So they keep on getting food or supplies from a store within the mining community, which they owe something out of it. But the prices are very high that when they get their money, it only goes back as a debt and paying those the food that they got from those stores. So is there really hope that these communities would really get out from poverty, or like what several of our people we talked to would just say like, how I wish they would just stop, and then we go back to what we were, and hopefully rehabilitate, because for them, like they said, like it's becoming hopeless for them.
Any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, first, companies are required to pay, something like a 1.5% royalty to local governments. So it's also, it can be not very much money, if a company is not that large. And in a lot of these cases, these are not massive mines, but it's the cumulative impacts from many small mines together that has an impact. So sometimes this money is not enough to even provide basic services to communities, to have good medical care and good schools that communities need. So first of all, understanding, is this 1.5% royalty even sufficient to actually address the needs of communities? Second is the role of local governments in deciding how that royalty is used, as well as local governments that are making other money from taxes, and so the local governments have a responsibility here. They should be, first and foremost, listening to the demands of local communities, but they should be a liaison between the communities and the mining companies. The local governments have a role both in providing permitting, but also understanding how they are engaging in the community. So we, across the board, need more local governments to step up. There are incredible cases in both Dinagat Island and Surigao del Sur where local mayors have been quite outspoken and in support of local communities who face these impacts. But it cannot just be one or two people, one or two mayors standing alone. It needs to be broad consensus. This is the role of government to protect the rights of people. It's also the role of the national government. The national government has a huge role in permitting mines. It should be ensuring that these companies are fully, consulting with people, and that people understand the impacts. When people say, we regret allowing them here, it's because they didn't even know what mining was going to be. If they were just promised good jobs and high salaries, but they weren't told about the pollution, they weren't told about the health impacts. So it's also the role of the national government to ensure that these processes are done correctly, that communities fully understand the impacts. And they should also be making sure that people's basic rights are guaranteed. The Filipino government has legal obligations to uphold the rights of the people of the Philippines. These are severe human rights violations that we're documenting in the report, and that most importantly, local communities and NGOs have been raising for years. This is not the first time, a report like this has come out, and I really hope it's the last. These are findings and concerns that people have had for decades, across the Philippines. And so really understanding the role of the Filipino government and ensuring that it is fully, living up to its obligations to ensure the rights of communities are being respected.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah. The first question, there is very little assurance that actual development can be transferred to the local communities. And I say that simply because the whole land use in the area has been permanently changed. So all of the social, economic, and political relationships that were supposed to be the building blocks of wealth and development before mining was introduced is suddenly disrupted. So incomes from farms or other livelihoods, then the very social fabric of relationships, some are opposed, some are supportive of mining, and then from salary, subsistence, everything is changed. And I think the adjustment there, the conflict and the disruption is so much that it will be very difficult for actual wealth to be transferred and development to be recovered simply because the permanent change in the land has introduced so much radical changes, not only on the economy, but on the politics and in the social relationship of that community. Not to mention the environmental and natural resource changes. I mean, you deforest, you change the course of the river, and then all the other impacts of climate. But I think the other side of, I'm a firm believer of local autonomy. I started development work 25 years ago, and from day one, I knew that decentralization was a very important key to genuine sustainable development. But what we have seen, and my point earlier, when you have local governments who are beneficial owners, whether it's mining, logging, or a part of the value chain, if they provide security or tracking service or any infrastructure support to any extractive projects, ultimately, the local government will have their own personal and business agenda as priority and not the welfare and convenience and benefit of the population. And then you repeat the cycle in election time because the powerful companies will finance the politicians. And then you have now graft and corruption. And this is where we will never see, no matter how capacitated the local government is. And I am being very generous now. If that local governments have a high capacity of knowing what the mining corporations owe them, that their tax system is robust and transparent, that they can actually understand environmental impact assessment and mitigation and understand financial reports of corporate. I am being very generous at that already. But assuming they are, the exposure to corruption and undue political influence will radically limit the ability of a local government to deliver the promise of development and welfare for their constituency. That's why I think whether we look at it at the impact of mining to the family and to the community, or the impact of the mining to the governance in the area, in both ends, the communities are at the losing end.
Yeah, I think I saw Beverly Longin raise her hands. But before you answer, Beverly, just a reminder that lunch is ready. It's past 12, so baka nagugutom na kayo.
Good afternoon. I'm Beverly Longid. I'm from Katribu and Asia Indigenous Peoples PAC. Some quick comments. No? I look forward to reading the full report. No? But I think on a quick scan of the summary that you provided, and of course also the input of JB, the report or the situation in Dinagat reflects the situation of indigenous peoples and other mining impacted communities across the country and across and Asia. And I think we can use this as further proof of the damage that destructive mining brings on. Because I really don't know how much evidence does government need to really act on mining as it is framed and oriented at present. Two, I would agree that there's really a need to do some investigation, not only on the operations of mining per se, but the relations between local government units and even government agencies, especially the DNR and the National Commission on Indigenous Peoples, because as JB mentioned, there's connivance, but now that we are inspecting the issue of corruption in the Philippines, corruption is not only limited to flood control. I think we have to look into all aspects of governance, because I would remember that when Colonel Kapuyan was Executive Director of the National Commission on Indigenous Peoples, the coffee table book that the NCIP produced, was produced, published because of donations from mining company. And I would just imagine what was behind funding. If they could fund a very, very good coffee table book, I mean, that's peanuts, no, for mining companies. So that's something that we have to look into. Third, on the issue of enforced legislation, I think we have to be clear on what legislation do we want to be enforced, because I would agree that the Philippines has an overabundance of very good laws, but it also has an overabundance of bad laws. And maybe this time we should again call again to revisit specifically the Philippine Mining Act of 1995, because it's still there. I mean, it's still the legal framework for mining, and may also to revisit the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act of 1997. True, there's a provision on free prior informed consent or even information, etc., but they always hide behind the provision of prior vested rights. And as you mentioned, many of the mining permits would trace back to American period. And in the Cordillera where I come from, most of the mining permits would also trace their original permits during a Spanish colonization. So prior vested rights, no? So in that case, FPIC gets to be exempted. And probably last, on the issue of civil and political rights violations, indeed, no, it's something that's happening. I mean, it's not only experienced by me or others. So there's really a direct correlation between mining resistance or activism in relation to violations. So now it's not only criminalization, it used to be murder, etc., and all of this illegal possession of firearms to red tagging, but now because of anti-terror law, we are facing terrorist designation. So unfortunately, my colleagues in the CPA, we're still fighting this. Nothing has really moved. Our bank accounts have been frozen, including the personal bank accounts of current officers of the Cordillera People's Alliance. So it's getting to be from bad to worse, no? So maybe to add to close from what JB mentioned, that we are tired, hungry, and scared. But push has become, when push comes to shove, no, people are also fighting. So we are tired, scared, and hungry, but now we are also fighting. So I mean, these are just some of my comments, and thank you very much for the research, and hopefully we can do more research in other aspects of the mining and other destructive projects. So thank you very much, JB and Krista.
Thank you, Beverly Lungid. The next is Raymond from Codao. But before, Raymond, before you say anything, I'd like to just, because this is related to what Beverly said, Alma Sinumlag, I think she's with IPRI, Indigenous People's Rights, asked a question online. Perhaps Krista can answer. She'd like to know more of how the indigenous peoples in Caraga and Dinagat Island are impacted. Were there particular documentation of how IPs, how the collective rights of IPs were impacted?
Yeah, thank you, Alma. In Dinagat, the reality is that there are not major IP communities that are directly impacted. And part of our methodology is we document harms based on first-person interviews with people, so people who are directly telling us about their impacts. And so throughout the report, even though there's significant concerns across the Philippines around the impacts of mining on Indigenous people's rights, it is not a significant part of this piece of research because we were not able to interview IPs directly in a way that was significant. And so out of respect for people and their own perceptions of how it's impacting them, we're not trying to put words into people's mouths. In some communities in Surigao, there are mining communities that are financially benefiting, and for many reasons. Some people are outspoken in support of mining, but there's not a lot of public outreach, particularly from people who are concerned about the impacts of mining. And so that is definitely, a place where, I would encourage, as Beverly says, more research and understanding into actually how do people feel about this, particularly if you take away, the impacts with security and concerns. And so, it is a huge piece. Across this is also not just a Philippines issue, it is a global issue around indigenous people's rights in mining. So, over half of the world's mining projects for transition minerals, so, minerals needed for the energy transition, are on indigenous people's lands. This so makes indigenous peoples around the world disproportionately impacted by mining for this energy transition. And so across the board, it is incredibly important that indigenous rights are fully respected. These are intersecting issues of indigenous rights and climate change and human rights that you can't just ignore with this piece. So it's incredibly important that people are able to exercise their right to self-determination and the right to free prior informed consent, and as part of FPIC, the right to say no to projects, and that must be fully respected.
Yeah, thank you. Before I go to Raymond here, I think we need to pause a little bit, make this a little bit more informal. We can continue the conversation. You can continue to ask questions, but please partake of the lunch. It might get cold. But yeah, here's Raymond.
Yeah, Krista, did the study look into the role of corporate media outfits owned by mining interests and the role in whitewashing the effects of nickel mining in the communities? And then what would be your response if there would be more incessant push through these media outfits in pushing forward the mining's narrative in discussions about the environment, economy?
Yeah, thank you for that, Raymond. So as part of this research, we talked to people about how it's, this issue concerns them. And so for some people are concerned about this, are concerned about these popular narratives and the role of companies within media. But it is not a key focus of our report, because our report mostly focuses on the ways that it's impacting the communities directly. But it is something that we heard quite some concerns about. And I think, a big piece comes to, the way that we're doing this research. We're directly engaging with local communities. We're giving companies the opportunity to include their perspectives in the report in communities and or in government. So, when the government with companies don't respond to us, like, that perspective is not in the report. And so, I really encourage, particularly, all media outlets to go and to talk to people directly. I think the field reporting is really important on issues like this. It's obviously a very visual issue, and I think it's quite important to go and see. But I think understanding that, local communities may have a different perspective on this issue from companies. And so only reporting on one side of this equation is never going to be, a full understanding of the investigation. And so that's why it's important to also, be talking to all these different stakeholders. At the end of the day, this report interviews over 60 or roughly 60 community members. That is a lot of data points, and for across the board, people to have these similar impacts. And so I think, if it's really important that the media also, incorporates these voices from the front lines.
Well, we haven't done any specific study about media owned by mining individuals with connections to mining companies. But I think in the past 10 years, our experience with the media can be described as frustrating and at some point really also deeply sad. For one, we have experienced zero coverage of mining-related issues from broadsheets and top broadcast company. And we simply cannot understand Because some reporters and even editors would tell us, you got chopped on the last minute, either from the news sequence in the early evening news or on the environment page of broadsheets. I have producers and editors who tell me that the day after some articles were supposed to come out, and the only explanation they can say is the decision was above my pay grade. And you have an editor and a producer telling that the decision was above my pay grade. So we can only assume that higher ups, probably owners or stockholders of this media company, are the ones who are making sure that, but by the way, it's not greenwashing. No? They're preventing the bad news about the mining incidents or corporations to come out. But the other evidence we have on that is that, some reporters and some columnists who cannot be controlled by the owners do issue. So for example, Ted Filon or Jessica Soho, some top names of broadcast. I mean, nobody can stop them if they start and if they decide to cover mining as an issue. And then columnists in broadsheets are, of course, have a fairly more freedom to write anything what they want. So that has been the strategy of most environmental rights defenders. We approach columnists, and then we purposively and consciously pitch stories to top caliber broadcasters and reporters, and then let them decide to probably not cover us as news, but cover us as opinion pieces. So, Jessica Soho will not put mining on the news sequence, but probably feature it on her kasama mo, Jessica Soho program. Or Ted Filon and Ed Lingao will not cover it on the news cycle of TV5. They will put it on the opinion editorial piece of their respective programs. So I think there is a real pressure from owners of mining companies to use their media platforms to control the narratives.
Thank you, JB. Yeah.
Good afternoon. I'm Dominic from the Commission on Human Rights of the Philippines. Thank you for this research. This will be a great help to the National Human Rights Institution of the country as we ramp up our investigative monitoring on issues on economic, social, and cultural rights. We continuously do investigative monitoring on issues, not just on issues related to natural hazards, human-induced displacements, but of course on development aggression. And as the country's National Human Rights Institution, in partnership with duty bearers, the government, state and non-state actors, civil society organizations, we would definitely be on guard for grave human rights violations as a consequence of these particular issues. And we have regional offices in all administrative regions of the country, which, of course, can be tapped by, anyone, because we cater to those vulnerable, marginalized, and disadvantaged sectors of society. Thank you. Thank you for this. Thank you so much.
Yeah, any other comment, question? Yes, Mark.
Probably the last question. Is there any viable alternatives? I mean, generally, in terms of energy transition, is it really just because it's the same people running dirty energy are now pushing for renewables. Uh, is energy, the shift from coal to renewables is really enough, or do we need a power shift?
Thanks. I like your question. Yeah, I mean, I think there's like a few different answers, and I'll try to do my best, and I'm happy to hear what JV says too. But I think we have to stop burning fossil fuels. The Typhoon Tino has destroyed people's homes today, last night. Across the world, the climate crisis is exceedingly the most significant human rights crisis of our lifetime. Millions of people are impacted with extreme heat, health impacts, extreme weather events, disasters. So I think the status quo of continuing to burn coal, to burn other fossil fuels, just cannot continue. There's no excuse. But there is a risk that if we kind of continue allowing extractive industries to dominate the narrative, that we'll see the same cycles of abuse of local communities, abuse of the environment, abuse of the climate. And so I think that is why it's important to understand the way that it's impacting people right now and to change course, because the way that extractive industries are harming people today is not sustainable, and it is not a part of a just transition. It's not a climate solution to make very vulnerable climate communities in the Philippines more vulnerable to climate change. Like in no way does that fit the definition of what a just transition should be. And so I think that is why it's important to really get this right the first time, or this time around. In terms of alternatives, there's a lot of people ask me this question around, like, do we even need nickel? Because a lot of car companies don't use nickel. Some of the most, the largest Chinese electric vehicle companies don't use nickel. But the reality is it probably will be continued to be used in EV batteries for the future. There's not really for lack of a better term, silver bullet, where there's one good solution for the entire industry. So the reality is that there will still be demand for nickel, including for things like EVs and for energy storage. And so, even though there might be, less demand from some ways if one battery chemistry is prioritized versus the other, but the reality is that this will be still used. But this question that that JB started with around the circularity and demand from the global north is really important. And in part of our report, we include recommendations to high consuming economies in the global north, like the United States, Canada, and European Union member states, that just replicating these same systems where every household has 4 cars, is not a solution. We need to actually have a good understanding of circularity and systems change, including within the transport system. So I hope that maybe a slight part helps answer your question, and happy for you to.
Yeah. Quickly, I think an energy transition is necessary, and it is an aspiration, but I think it's attainable. But there are basic challenges. For example, in the Philippines, we don't even have a clear Philippine energy plan. When Popoy Lotilla was still with the DOE, that has been a standing demand of the civil society. Produce that Philippine energy plan and let us review it and subject it to a rigid analysis and a projection. That was never delivered. So absence of a clear policy is a major hindrance for us to actually seriously talk about the energy transition in the Philippines. Second, when you have policymakers who have their own vested interests because they are owners of mining and these energy companies, we cannot realistically expect a real and genuine energy transition. The interest of their business interests and their family interests will always be paramount. So I think those two major hindrances is what is preventing us from actually going into serious discussion and planning and implementation of any energy transition in the Philippines. But in a broader sense, the Philippines is just part of the global economy. And when you have bigger economies who are consuming a lot more resources and energy, I don't think it's realistic that we I don't think it's realistic that we will have an energy transition unless a major systemic shift happens. I mean, you have Saudi Arabia who wants to host the 2029 Asian Winter Games with a totally artificial city that will have 24/7 snow, complete with the Alps and everything. It's a whole city in the desert. And the energy and the infrastructure required to do that is something like 2 or 3 times the economy and resources of Saudi Arabia to host with that kind of prioritization. I don't think the planet will be able to withstand those requirements from us. So yes, we need to discuss this energy transition, but unless there is serious discussion on we need to shift the kind of the form, kind, and mode of development that we are doing, we are just going to discuss fairy tales and dreams in Belém in November.
Thank you, JB. And I think that's a good ending to our live stream. We shall end the live stream now, but we will continue talking because I think we just started. So let's do that.
Thank you. I also need a CR break.
Okay, thank you. So